She found it because she was lost. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the storm. Not the 2 nights alone in the dark. Not the 137 years of waiting compressed into a single right angle, glimpsed through curtains of moss and rain. Just that. She had chosen that trail because nothing was supposed to happen on it. She was wrong about that in every possible way. Deep in the forest, where no map showed anything, where no record named anything, something had been standing in the trees since 1887, waiting. Not passively, with intention. Built by hands that understood forces. Sealed by a man who knew he might not make it out. He left instructions on the wall. They still worked. She found the letter last. 4 words at the bottom of a drawing no one had seen in over a century. She read it once. Then she sat down on the floor of a dead man's house and understood that her life was about to change in a direction she had not planned for and could not refuse. Margaret Calloway had a system for making hard decisions. She made lists, not the kind people keep on their phones, scrolling past with their thumbs. Real lists, paper, pen, 2 columns left and right, pros and cons, written in the kind of handwriting that meant business. She had made lists for everything that mattered in her adult life. The house in Portland, the partnership with Daniel, graduate school, the divorce, especially the divorce. That list had taken 3 legal pads and 4 days. And in the end, both columns had been exactly equal. Same number of reasons on each side. Same weight. Same careful handwriting. She had signed the papers anyway. That was the thing about lists. They gave you the illusion that you were being rational, that you were the kind of person who weighed things properly before acting. What they didn't tell you was that sometimes you already knew the answer before you picked up the pen. You were just buying yourself time to catch up to it. She stood in the parking lot of her office building on a Tuesday morning in late October, keys in one hand, a manila folder in the other, and stared at the door she had walked through nearly every workday for 6 years. The folder contained a contract, 42 pages, reviewed by her attorney, generous terms, a salary that would make her ex-husband do a slow blink if he ever found out, full benefits, a title that sounded important at dinner parties. Senior Director of Heritage Compliance, Hartwell Group, Pacific Northwest Division. She had until Friday. The thing was, she didn't want to go inside. Not because she was afraid of the decision. She had been afraid of bigger things. She didn't want to go inside because she already knew that the moment she sat down at her desk and looked at the familiar slant of afternoon light on the drafting table, she would feel the same thing she had been feeling for the past 4 months, which was nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just the particular quiet of a room where something used to live. She went inside anyway. Her office smelled like old paper and wood stain. Coffee from the morning still sat cold in a mug that said "World's Okayest Architect," a gift from her assistant Pam 3 Christmases ago. 2 of the walls were covered in photographs of projects, buildings she had pulled back from the edge. A 1920s schoolhouse in Walla Walla. A timber frame farmhouse outside Tacoma that had been condemned twice before she got her hands on it. A covered bridge in rural Kitsap County that the county had been ready to tear down for a parking lot. She had argued for each one, measured every joint and beam, written reports that ran longer than most people's theses, stood in front of planning boards and said, with the quiet authority of someone who had done the math, "This structure wants to stand. You just have to let it." She sat down, looked at the drafting table, felt the quiet. The Hartwell Group was not a bad company. That was the most honest thing she could say about them. They did real preservation work, followed code, hired people who knew what they were doing. They were simply very large, and very organized, and very committed to a particular way of moving through the world that had more to do with liability management than with the strange, stubborn love you had to have for a broken old building to save it properly. Meg understood liability management. She did not love it. She opened her desk drawer and found under a stack of site reports a printout of a trail map. Olympic Peninsula, a corridor route that ran through old-growth forest in the northern foothills, following what had once been a wagon supply path in the late 1800s. She had printed it 3 weeks ago and then put it under things so she didn't have to look at it. She pulled it out now. She needed 3 days. That was all. 3 days in a place without cell service and without that folder, and without anyone using the phrase strategic portfolio alignment within earshot. Friday was 4 days away. She called Pam and told her she'd be out of the office until Thursday. Pam paused, then said, "Should I be worried?" "No," Meg said. "Are you taking your first aid kit?" "Yes." "Your emergency locator?" "Yes." "Your common sense?" Meg looked at the folder on her desk. "Working on it," she said. She drove home and packed with the focus of someone who had done this before, which she had. Hiking had been hers since college, before Daniel, before the firm, before everything had weight and consequence. She had logged enough trail miles over the years to know what mattered and what was extra. Food for 4 days, though she planned for 3. Layers that could handle anything short of a true winter storm. A compact medical kit. A handheld GPS device, old and scratched, that she trusted more than any app. She checked the forecast before bed, cool, partly cloudy. No significant precipitation. She checked it again in the morning, same. She drove north. The transition happened the way it always did. The city thinned. Strip malls gave way to gas stations, gave way to scattered houses, gave way to fields. Then, the fields gave way to trees, and the trees got taller. And suddenly the road was narrower, and the light was different, and she could breathe in a way that she had forgotten she was supposed to. She pulled into the trailhead parking area a little before noon. One other car sat at the far end of the lot. An older model pickup, Forest Service green, with a rusted roof rack and a bumper sticker that had faded past legibility. She locked her car, adjusted her pack straps, and was 3 steps toward the trailhead when she heard someone behind her. "You're heading in pretty late in the day." She turned. The man standing by the pickup was in his late 60s. Tall, but the kind of tall that had settled some with age. White hair cut short under a battered canvas hat. A field vest covered in pockets that were all being used. He was holding a notebook in one hand and looking at her with the direct but not unfriendly expression of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and had stopped apologizing for it. "It's not that late," she said. "Sunset's at 4:53. He said it without checking anything. Just knew it. "You've got the Ridgeback Corridor Trail?" "That's the one." He nodded slowly. The way people nod when they're deciding how much to say. "I'm Raymond Greer. I do historical survey work out here. Have for about 20 years. Meg Calloway." "Preservation?" She looked at her jacket, wondering what had given it away. Then realized she was still wearing her firm's embroidered vest over her base layer. She had forgotten to change. "Architect," she said. "Historic preservation focus." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Just a slight adjustment, like a door opening a crack. "This corridor has some interesting history," he said. "Frontier wagon route originally. Supply path during early logging operations. Most people don't know it." He paused. "There are also some structural anomalies in this section that I've been trying to pin down for a while. Indications of a settlement that doesn't appear in any official record." She should have kept walking. She knew that. The light was already past its peak and she wanted to make 5 miles before she stopped. "What kind of settlement?" she said. "That's the question." He reached into one of the vest pockets and produced a business card. Actual cardstock, slightly worn at the corners. She hadn't seen anyone hand over a physical business card in 2 years. "If you come across anything unusual, structural, anything that doesn't belong, I'd appreciate a call." She took the card. "What counts as unusual?" she said. "Straight lines," he said. "Right angles. Anything that looks like a decision." She looked at him for a moment. Then she put the card in her jacket pocket, adjusted her pack, and headed for the trailhead. She didn't look back. The forest closed around her within the first quarter mile, and she felt her shoulders drop about 2 inches. That was always how it happened. You didn't notice how much you were holding until the trees took it from you. The canopy here was old growth, the firs running up so high they made the sky feel like a suggestion. The ground was soft underfoot, layered with decades of fallen needles, and the light came down in long slanted columns that moved when the branches moved. She had missed this. She had not realized quite how badly she had missed this. The trail was exactly what the map had promised. Gentle grades, occasional wide sections where the ground was compressed and pale, remnants of the old wagon corridor. She could see it clearly once she knew to look. the slight depression where wheels had cut into earth over and over across decades. The way the trees grew in almost rows on either side where the original path had cleared them. History liked to leave these traces, not loud ones, just the quiet, physical evidence of people who had passed through and changed the ground beneath their feet. She walked for 2 hours without thinking about the folder. That was progress. The first sign that the weather was changing came the way it always came out here. Not dramatically, just a shift in the quality of the light, a flatness, the way sound carried differently when pressure changed. She had been paying attention to terrain, to the trail, to the particular way this stretch of forest felt different from the last. She noticed the change the way you notice when a conversation goes quiet. Something that had been present simply wasn't anymore. She stopped, looked up through the canopy. Clouds, not the thin, high kind that came and went. These were layered and gray, and moving with purpose. She checked her watch. Just past 3. She checked the GPS. 2.5 miles from the nearest marked shelter point. She pulled out the printed forecast, already knowing it was useless now, and looked at it anyway. No significant precipitation. The forest made a sound like a long exhale, and then the rain started. Not hard at first, just a presence. The sound of it on the canopy before it reached her. The slow progression downward through the layers of the forest until it landed on her jacket in cold, scattered drops. She kept moving. She had a good jacket. She had been in rain before. The shelter point was 2.5 miles, and that was manageable. Except the trail started doing something that trails weren't supposed to do. It got ambiguous. That was the only word for it. The path had been clear and definite, a genuine corridor, and then gradually, subtly, it began to dissolve. A section that had been open was now obscured by fallen branches. A turn she expected didn't materialize. The ground, soft before, was now taking water badly, the needle-covered surface saturated, the depressions filling faster than she could step around them. She slowed, stopped, turned a full circle. The trees behind her looked less certain than they had 20 minutes ago. The ones ahead blurred into each other in the rain and the low light. Okay, she thought. Okay, she pulled out the GPS. The screen showed her position. She could see the trail corridor on the map, a clear line. She appeared to be roughly on it, but roughly was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Drift happened. Trail landmarks that were obvious in good light stopped being obvious in rain. She had 3 more hours before full dark. She made a decision. Keep moving forward. The trail had to correct itself eventually. Except it didn't. The rain intensified. The wind came up from nowhere specific, changing direction every few minutes as if it were genuinely undecided. It drove the rain sideways, then diagonal, then sideways again. She pulled her hood tighter and kept her eyes on the ground, looking for the compressed pale earth of the wagon route. It had disappeared. Not gradually. Just gone. The ground here was all the same, water dark and churned, old roots and new mud and fallen wood in every direction. She stopped walking. That was the right call. She knew it immediately. Moving when you didn't know where you were going was how people got from lost to very lost. She stood still and ran through what she knew. She was in the old corridor section of the trail. The terrain to the north sloped upward. There was no significant water source for another 1.5 miles. The GPS showed her in the right general zone, but the trail had gone wrong somewhere in the last 30 minutes, and she hadn't caught it fast enough. She needed shelter, not preferred. Needed. The temperature had dropped 7 degrees in the last hour, and the rain showed no intention of stopping, and the sky was already the wrong color for 3 in the afternoon. She started scanning. Not for the trail, for anything useful. A rock formation with overhang. A cluster of large firs that would break the wind. Anything. She almost walked past it. That was the thing she would think about later. How close she came to not seeing it at all. She had her head down against the wind, watching the ground, and she caught it in her peripheral vision. Just a shape. Just a difference in the texture of the shadows. She stopped. She turned her head, and she saw a right angle. That was all it was. One clean right angle, in a forest where nothing was straight. Where every line curved and every edge softened, and everything grew in the direction of light and water and time. This was a corner, an actual corner, there in the dimness between 2 large firs, partially hidden by a curtain of hanging moss and the overgrowth of what looked like at least 2 decades of aggressive vegetation. She stood very still. The rain drummed on her hood. She thought about what the man in the parking lot had said. Straight lines, right angles, anything that looks like a decision. She moved toward it, carefully. The ground was uneven and wet, and she didn't know what she was walking into. She pushed through the low-hanging moss and stepped around a root system that had grown up around something solid, and there it was, a structure. Her brain needed a moment to parse it, because it was not one thing, it was layers. The bottom layer was a wagon. She could see the wheels first, iron-rimmed and enormous, sunk so deeply into the earth that the roots of a nearby tree had grown through the spokes on one side. The wheels were still there, corroded, moss-covered but present, refusing to disappear. Above the wagon frame, walls had been built up, not in a hurry, not desperately, carefully. The logs were fitted together with mortise joints, the corners notched with a precision she could identify from 15 feet away, because she had spent the last 20 years looking at how old structures were built. The walls had been added in stages. She could see it in the layers of timber. First this, then this, then this. Each addition answering a problem the previous one had revealed. Someone had turned a wagon into a house, not as a temporary measure, as a commitment. She stood there in the rain for a long moment, getting wetter, and let that fact settle into her. Then she walked forward and looked at the door. It was intact. That was the first remarkable thing. A solid slab of dark wood reinforced with iron hardware that had gone from black to the particular brown-gray of very old oxidized metal. It was not hanging open. It was not warped off its hinges. It was closed, as if someone had stepped out and intended to come back. She put her hand on the latch, felt the weight of crossing a line that didn't have anything to do with the physical structure in front of her. The wind pushed her from behind. Hard, cold, she lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Old wood. Dry. Not the damp rot smell she had expected, that particular soft decay of a structure that had given up. This was the smell of wood that had been sealed from moisture, preserved by its own integrity. The air inside was cool but not cold, not the biting cold of the forest. Something in between. She stepped inside. Her eyes adjusted. The space was narrow, maybe 8 feet wide at its widest point, longer than it was wide, following the original dimensions of the wagon bed, but every inch of it had been used. There was a built-in bench along one wall with a storage chest beneath it, the lid worn smooth. A small table hinged flat against the opposite wall, latched in the folded position. Shelves along the upper sections, their contents long since gone to dust except for the shapes they had left behind. Everything had a place. Nothing had been left without purpose. Her eyes went to the stove, because of course there was a stove. It sat slightly off-center, iron, compact, with a flue pipe that ran upward through the roof in a careful straight line. She crossed to it and crouched, running her hands along the seams with the automatic assessment of someone who had evaluated 1,000 old structures. The metal was dark with age but not compromised. The joints were tight. The flue fitting, where it met the roof, was insulated with what looked like carefully fitted sheet metal guards. Someone had known exactly how hot this pipe would get, and had planned for it accordingly. She stood and turned slowly, and she saw the walls properly. Not the broad strokes, the details. There were marks carved into the wood beside the stove. She moved closer, wiping her jacket sleeve across the surface, and the marks resolved into lines. Deliberate, careful, uniform in depth. Not decorative. Not initials carved by bored hands. These were numbers, measurements, notes written with the precision of someone who expected to need to read them again. And beside them, worked directly into the surface of the wall itself, were lines. She stopped breathing for a moment, because she knew what she was looking at. She had spent 20 years looking at structural drawings, on paper, on vellum, on the backs of envelopes when the job needed to move faster than the paperwork. She knew the visual grammar of a working drawing, the way load paths were indicated, the way angles were shown in relation to each other, the way someone who understood structural behavior thought visually on a surface. These were not decorations. These were engineering notes, scratched into the wood of a frontier Wagon house in the middle of an old-growth forest by someone who had been working out a problem and needed a surface big enough to think on. She stood there with rain still dripping from her jacket and the forest howling outside, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Curiosity. Real, specific, directed curiosity. Not the vague wondering she'd been moving through for the past few months. This particular question. Who built this? And what were they trying to figure out? She set her pack down near the door, shook off her jacket. The interior temperature wrapped around her immediately, not warm exactly, but protected, stable. The storm outside pressed against the walls with occasional gusts that made the structure creak, but the creak was a response, not a warning. The building was answering, not breaking. She found the instruction marks for the stove almost by accident. She had been examining the carved notes, trying to parse the numbers, when she saw the text. Lower down, below the measurements, in smaller, closer writing. She had to lean in and angle toward the light from the window to read it properly. The spelling was archaic, the phrasing clipped, but the content was unmistakably practical. Wind from the north, close the lower intake to half. Flue will draw stronger with the upper vent open 2 fingers during heavy weather. In storm, do not open fully. Wait for pressure to settle before building high. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She found her fire kit in the side pocket of her pack. Small wax starters, a compact bundle of cedar shavings she kept for exactly this kind of situation. She opened the stove door and looked inside. Old ash compacted into a dense gray layer, bone dry. The flue above was dark, but when she held her lighter flame near the opening, the flame tilted, upward. There was a draw, the chimney was clear. She set up the fire carefully, following the instructions on the wall. Half-closed lower intake, upper vent 2 fingers. She struck the lighter. The flame caught the cedar shavings and held. She watched the smoke. It rose, hesitated for the space of 1 breath, then moved decisively upward into the flue and was gone. She sat back on her heels and stared at the small growing fire, with an expression she was glad no one could see, because it was the expression of someone who had just been helped by a dead person, who had just followed instructions left by hands that had been still for over 100 years. And it had worked. The system the unknown builder had designed and described and scratched into the wood of this wall had functioned exactly as intended. The iron stove began to tick as it warmed. Outside, the storm threw itself against the walls of the house. The house held. She unpacked methodically. Food she didn't feel like eating but needed to. A dry layer she pulled on over her base. Her sleeping pad unrolled on the built-in bench. The stove throwing heat into the small space with steady, quiet competence. She sat and looked at the fire through the narrow gap in the stove door. She thought about the folder on her desk. The 42 pages. The title that sounded important at dinner parties. She thought about Daniel, not with pain, particularly. More with the dull recognition of a problem she had identified too late. They had been good at the same things. That was the problem. Both organized. Both self-contained. Both convinced that being self-contained was a virtue, rather than a habit you could mistake for a life. She had not cried when the divorce finalized. She had made a list. She looked around the dim interior of the wagon house. The engineering notes on the wall caught the light from the stove. She got up and crouched beside them again, this time with the small flashlight from her pack. The drawings were more extensive than she'd first realized. They weren't confined to one area. They ran along the wall in sections, interrupted by the shelf brackets and the stove fitting, but connected. A continuous working record. She traced one of the lines with her finger without touching it. It showed the roofline of the structure, the pitch and the angle of the overhang she had noticed from outside. And beside it, in that same clipped handwriting, a note. Angle at 22 degrees sheds water clear of the door. Less and it pools. More and the wind takes it wrong. She sat back. 22 degrees. She pulled out her notebook, wrote the number down, then stopped and looked at what she'd written. She was taking field notes on a structure she'd found by accident in the middle of a forest, in the middle of a storm, while lost on a trail she had chosen specifically because nothing was supposed to happen on it. She almost laughed. Almost. The storm reached its first peak around 8 o'clock. She knew this because she checked her watch, which was a habit she couldn't break, and because the sound outside changed, became less like weather and more like intention. The wind was no longer gusting. It was sustained, a low constant pressure against the walls that made the logs speak in low, measured tones, each flex, and return a small proof of structural integrity. She had been in enough old buildings to know the difference between a structure that was struggling and a structure that was managing. This one was managing, handily. The roof didn't leak. The door, secured with the wooden bar she had found, fitted perfectly into iron brackets on either side of the frame, did not rattle. The stove drew steadily. She added fuel carefully. Not too much. She didn't know how long she'd need it. She lay down on the bench, pack as a pillow, and closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. She was wrong. She woke at some point in the night to the sound of something hitting the roof. Not the rain. Something heavier. A branch, probably. She lay still for a moment, assessing. The stove had burned low. The fire needed attention. She was stiff from the bench and cold in the way that crept in slowly when the heat source weakened. She got up and added fuel to the stove. While she waited for the fire to build, she stood in the center of the small room and looked around at what the lower, unsteady light showed her. The care in this place. That was what she kept coming back to. Not the ingenuity, though that was real. The care, the wooden bar for the door, fitted to its brackets with a precision that didn't happen by accident. The overhang angle calculated to 22 degrees. The flue insulation. The stove instructions written where anyone who needed them would find them. The storage built beneath the bench so that floor space wasn't wasted. The table hinged to the wall so it could be used when needed and out of the way when it wasn't. Every decision in this space had been made by someone who was thinking about the person who would be here next. She stood there in the warmth of the rebuilt fire and felt, for the first time in months, that she was somewhere that had been built with full attention. And she understood, standing there at 2 a.m. in a forest in Olympic Peninsula, that she had been missing that, not in buildings, in her own life. The feeling that someone had thought carefully about what was needed, and built accordingly, and then had the honesty to write the instructions on the wall where you could find them. She went back to the bench. She lay down. She looked at the engineering notes on the wall, lit faintly by the stove glow. She thought, who were you? She thought, what were you trying to solve? She thought, why did you stay? She was still thinking those things when she fell asleep again. The storm had not finished with her. She knew that. Outside, the forest was still working through whatever the weather had brought, and morning would show her what that meant for the trail, and for the question of getting out. But that was morning. For now the walls held. For now the stove burned. For now, that was enough. She woke up before the light reached the window. Not because the storm woke her, because the storm had stopped. That was the thing. The silence. After hours of wind and pressure, and the low constant percussion of rain on the roof, the quiet landed like something physical, like a hand pressing flat against the air. She lay on the bench for a full minute, staring at the ceiling, listening to the nothing, before she understood what it meant. The storm had moved on, which should have been good news. Except, she sat up, reached for her jacket. The interior of the wagon house was still warm from the stove's overnight work, the embers reduced to a soft orange glow behind the iron door. Outside the small window, the light was wrong. Too white, too flat. The kind of light that meant cloud cover so complete it had erased the sky entirely. She opened the door and stopped. The tree was not there when she had gone to sleep. Or rather, it had been there, standing the way trees stood. And at some point in the night it had decided it was done with that particular arrangement and had come down across the only clear path she could see from the entrance. Not a small tree. A big one. The kind that had been growing for 60, 70 years. A Douglas fir with a trunk she could not have wrapped her arms around, now lying on its side with its root ball torn up and its broken crown buried in the undergrowth 30 feet away. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Right. Okay, fine. She was not leaving this morning. She went back inside. The first thing she did was tend the stove, practical before everything else. She had enough fuel for another day if she was careful. A mix of what she'd found stacked in the small storage space beneath the bench, old but dry, and what she'd gathered from the immediate area the evening before. She loaded it with the patience of someone who understood that heat was not a luxury out here. Heat was time, and time was what she needed to think. The second thing she did was drink water and eat something. Methodically, without appetite but with discipline. She had done enough backcountry hiking to know that the brain got dramatic when the body was cold and hungry, and the last thing she needed right now was her brain getting dramatic. The third thing she did was look at the notebook she had pulled from the drawer the night before. The one she had not opened. The one she had set on the table and left there, because some part of her understood that opening it was a different kind of decision than building a fire. She sat down at the hinged table, which she had unlatched and folded out the night before. The notebook lay exactly where she had left it. Dark green cover, warped slightly with age. The pages thickened from old moisture that had come and dried long ago. A leather cord wrapped around it twice and tied in a knot that had held for so long the cord had shaped itself permanently to the cover. She untied it and opened to the first page. The handwriting was dense. Not cramped exactly, but close. The letters formed with the consistency of someone who had been taught to write properly, and had then spent years writing fast. The ink was faded to a gray-brown that sometimes disappeared entirely at the edges of the pages, but the center of each line was clear enough. Thomas Hale, November 1887. That was how it started. Name, month, year, no preamble, no greeting. Just the practical beginning of someone who did not have time for flourishes. She turned the page. Arrived at this site October 14. Clara's condition worsened 3 days east of here. Could not risk further travel. The wagon holds. Will begin modification before the first freeze. 2 children. James is 8. Lily is 6. They do not yet understand we are staying. She read that last line 3 times. They do not yet understand we are staying. There was something in that sentence that sat wrong. Not the words. The completeness of the decision. The way it was written without anguish or apology. Just fact. They were staying. The children didn't know yet, and he was already thinking about what needed to be done before the weather turned. She kept reading. The early entries were logistics. What timber he had cut and from where. How he had assessed the wagon frame for load-bearing capacity before adding the walls. The specific notch joint he'd used at the corners. And why, a decision based on the compression forces he expected from the roof load, combined with wind pressure from the west, where the trees thinned and the gusts could build. He wrote about the roof pitch the way an engineer wrote about a problem he'd solved. 22 degrees. Best angle for watershed, while maintaining structural integrity given the frame dimensions. She looked up from the notebook at the roofline above her. 22 degrees. He had done the math in his head probably, or worked it out on paper that hadn't survived. And then he had built it, and then he had written it on the wall so that if anyone ever needed to know, they could find it. She felt the back of her neck do something strange. The entries got more detailed as the weeks went on. He described the stove installation with the kind of specificity that made her want to stand up and re-examine the fitting. He had calculated the flue diameter against the firebox volume and adjusted the intake vents to compensate for the elevation differential between this site and where he'd originally built the stove system back in Ohio. He knew what he was doing, not from formal training. She could tell that from the way he described things, working from observation and result rather than from principle. But the conclusions he reached were correct. She could verify that. She had the training to do it, and the evidence all around her. He was not a carpenter who happened to build something that held. He was a man who understood how forces worked, who thought in load paths and pressure differentials and material behavior, who had looked at an old wagon and seen a structural system waiting to be completed. She set the notebook down and just breathed for a minute, because what was in front of her was not a curiosity, not a charming piece of frontier history. What was in front of her was documentation of engineering, thinking that, if it had been formalized and submitted, would have placed Thomas Hale well ahead of the published literature on adaptive structural systems. The man had been working in the 1880s with concepts that didn't appear in building literature until the 1920s. And he had done it alone. In a forest, with a sick wife and 2 children who didn't yet understand they were staying. She picked up the notebook again. Clara is no better. I do not write about this often. There's not much useful to say. She sleeps more than she wakes. The children spend the mornings with her and the afternoons helping me as best they can. James is serious about it. He carries the small things without being asked, and does not complain about the cold. Lily cries sometimes in the evenings and then stops and does not cry again until the next evening. I do not know what to do with the crying except to let it happen. She had to stop reading for a moment. She looked at the wall, at the stove, at the particular quality of light coming through the small window. She thought about the word useful. He had written that there was not much useful to say about his wife being sick, and the acknowledgement that he knew that. The quiet, terrible logic of a man who was trying to hold everything together by staying focused on the things he could control, the timber, the angles, the vent adjustments. She understood that instinct completely. She had done the same thing for the last year and a half. Stayed very focused on the things she could measure. The projects, the reports, the lists. Because the alternative was to sit with the thing that didn't have a measurement, which was the specific quality of silence in her apartment on Sunday mornings, now that Daniel was gone. Not the absence of him exactly. More the absence of the structure they had built together, however imperfect, however quietly wrong it had become toward the end. She read on. January. Clara had passed in the night of December 30th. He wrote it the same way he wrote about the roof pitch. 1 sentence. Then the next thing. He had arranged a burial in the clearing to the east. He had marked the site and recorded the coordinates using the method he described in a separate page at the back of the notebook, a system of triangulation from 3 fixed points that he had notched into specific trees. She noted that. He was thinking about someone else finding the site, about someone else needing to know where Clara was. Then this. The children will go with the Patmore party when they come through in March. This is the decision. I have thought on it long enough. James argued with me. He is 8 years old and he argued with me with the specific logic of a child who has run out of other options. He said he would not go. I told him he would. He did not speak to me for 2 days. On the 3rd day he came to me in the morning and said he understood. I do not know if that is true, but I believed him. Lily cried. Both evenings and the mornings also. Then she stopped. She is more practical than her brother in some ways. She had been reading without stopping, and somewhere in that time the light through the window had shifted. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there. Her tea was cold. The stove needed attention. She noticed none of these things. She turned the page. The Patmore party came through on March 8th, earlier than expected. I had 2 more weeks of work I intended to complete before they arrived. I did not complete it. James and Lily left with the party at midday. James shook my hand when he left. He is 8 years old. He shook my hand like a man. She put the notebook down on the table. Face down, open to that page, she stood up and walked the 3 steps to the small window and looked out at the fallen tree and the white sky beyond it. James had been 8 years old. He had argued with his father because he didn't want to leave, and then he had stopped arguing, and then he had shaken his father's hand. She tried to imagine being that child, understanding at 8 years old that you were leaving and your father was staying, understanding it well enough to shake his hand, to say goodbye like an adult because you were in a situation that required adults and there weren't enough of them. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She was a 47-year-old architect in a waterproof jacket who had packed a proper emergency kit and was in no actual danger, and she was definitely not going to cry over a man who had been dead for 130 years. She cried a little. Not dramatically, just the specific quiet leak of emotion that happens when you've been holding something for a long time, and then something external creates an opening. She let it happen for about 45 seconds. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and went back to the stove and added fuel and sat down again. She picked up the notebook because she needed to know what came next. The post-March entries were shorter, fewer words per page, as if he had been conserving something, energy or emotion or both. He wrote about the structural modifications he completed alone, the second storage cavity he built into the floor, The adjustments to the stove system based on what he had learned through the winter. The way the roof performed in the March rains, and the one small section of the western wall he had reinforced after noticing a stress response he didn't like, and then buried between two entries about timber and one about a deer he had seen near the clearing, a single line. I am drawing up the full plans. If this design is worth building once, it is worth building properly. Someone should know how it works. She read that sentence 3 times. If this design is worth building once, it is worth building properly. She put the notebook down and looked around the wagon house with completely different eyes. She had been seeing it as a survival structure, as a remarkable piece of frontier improvisation, as evidence of one man's technical skill under extreme circumstances. She had not been seeing it as what it apparently was: an original design, a system, something he had intended to formalize and share. She got up. She went to the storage space beneath the bench and opened it. She had looked in there the night before, but not thoroughly. She had seen the folded fabric gone to dust, the few rusted implements, the general archaeology of a life compressed into a small space. She looked more carefully now. In the back corner, behind what had once been a folded wool blanket and was now a layered gray collapse, her fingers touched something that was not wood and not fabric. Metal. She moved the dust of the blanket aside carefully, breathing through her nose to avoid the dry cloud of it, and found a tin canister. Round. About the diameter of a soup can, but 3 times the length. The seam along the side was soldered. The lid was crimped and then soldered again over the crimp. Someone had wanted this sealed. She carried it to the table, sat down, turned it in her hands. The solder had done its job. Sealed for over 100 years, and the canister was dry, completely dry. Whatever was inside had been protected from every season that had come and gone above it. She got out her multi-tool, used the smallest blade carefully, working around the crimped lid rather than forcing it, the way you opened anything old that you didn't want to damage. The solder was brittle enough to crack with careful pressure. She worked slowly. She was not in a hurry. The fallen tree wasn't going anywhere, and neither was she. The lid came free. Inside, rolled tightly and wrapped in a layer of oilcloth that had darkened to the color of old leather but remained intact, were papers. She unrolled them on the table. 3 sheets, larger than the notebook pages. The paper was a heavier weight, almost drafting paper, the kind you could buy at a surveyor's supply in the 1880s if you knew where to look. And on those 3 sheets, in ink that had faded less than the notebook, because it had been sealed from the air, were drawings, actual drawings, plans, elevations, section cuts, the wagon house, documented in the formal language of architectural drawing, complete with dimensions and notation. She recognized the hand immediately, the same person who had written the notebook, but this handwriting was slower, more deliberate. The letters of the annotations formed with the care of someone who understood that these marks were meant to be read by someone else, in another place, at another time. At the bottom of the 3rd sheet, in the lower right corner where a title block would go on a formal drawing, he had written, Aldridge Mobile Dwelling System, T. Hale, 1888. She sat back. Aldridge. Not a name she had seen in the notebook. She flipped back through the pages quickly. No Aldridge. The name appeared nowhere in the written record she had been reading, which meant it was either a name he'd borrowed for the design, someone who had inspired it, a partner, a supplier, or it was a name from a part of the story she hadn't found yet. And then she noticed the 4th item in the canister. Not a drawing, an envelope, white once, ivory now. The flap sealed with a dark wax that had cracked along one edge but held along the rest. On the front, in the same deliberate hand as the drawings, to whoever finds this. She set it on the table, looked at it. The stove ticked. Outside, a bird called from somewhere in the drenched forest. One long note and then nothing. She had found things like this before. In the walls of buildings she had opened up for restoration. In the floors of old structures, beneath boards that hadn't been moved in decades. People left things behind. Not always on purpose. But sometimes, yes, on purpose. Sometimes someone understood that they were not going to be able to carry a thing forward themselves, and they placed it somewhere it might survive them, in the hope that eventually the right person would come along. She picked up the envelope, broke the remaining wax carefully along the cracked edge, unfolded the letter inside. His handwriting again, but different from both the notebook and the drawings. The notebook was fast. The drawings were formal. This was neither. This was the handwriting of someone writing carefully, because what they were saying mattered, but who was also tired. The letters were formed with attention, but the pressure varied, some lines heavier, some almost fading into the paper. If you have found this place, then it has survived. Which means, what I believed about it is true. A structure built with proper attention to its own forces will outlast the hands that made it. She stopped. Read that again. A structure built with proper attention to its own forces will outlast the hands that made it. She looked up at the ceiling, at the roof pitch. 22 degrees. Planned and built and still shedding water in 2024. She kept reading. My name is Thomas Hale. I came west from Ohio in the spring of 1887, with my wife Clara and our 2 children, James and Lily. We did not reach our destination. Clara died here in December of that year. James and Lily went on in March of 1888, with a party heading to Portland. I do not know where they are now. I hope they are well. I expect they are. I am staying. Not because I cannot leave. Because this is not finished. The drawings in this canister represent a design that I believe has value beyond my own use of it. The modifications I made to this wagon are not accidental. They follow from principles that any builder who thinks about forces and materials could understand and apply. I intended to bring these drawings to a city, to an institution, to someone who could put them to use. That may not happen. I am realistic about my circumstances. So I am putting them here, where they will keep. If you are reading this and you understand what the drawings show, please see that they reach someone who can use them. Not for my name. For the work. She read the letter through twice without stopping. Then she set it down on the table next to the drawings and the tin canister, the oilcloth, and she sat in the wagon house that Thomas Hale had built in 1887, and she said nothing at all for a very long time, because there wasn't anything to say. Because the man had built this place alone, had wintered here alone after his wife died, had sent his children away so they could have a future he couldn't give them in a forest, had stayed behind to finish something he believed mattered, had drawn up the plans with the intention of bringing them to someone who could use them, and had then sealed them in a tin canister in a hidden compartment in the floor, when he understood that he might not get the chance. Not for my name. For the work. She thought about her office, the photographs on the walls, the buildings she had saved. She thought about the Hartwell Group contract in the folder on her desk. Senior Director of Heritage Compliance. The title that sounded important at dinner parties. She thought about Daniel, about the particular slowness of the end of that marriage, about how she had made lists and weighed things and been very rational about all of it, and how none of that rationality had touched the actual feeling, which was simply that she had been present in her own life, without being fully in it for a very long time, and she didn't know when that had started or how to stop it. She looked at the letter. Not for my name. For the work. She picked up her own notebook, her own pen, and she began to document. She worked for 3 hours without stopping, photographed everything with her phone, the drawings, the letter, the notebook, the canister, the stove, the carved engineering notes on the wall. Then she measured the room dimensions, the structural elements she could access, the roof pitch, the placement of the stove relative to the walls. She sketched the mortise joints in the corners, the details of the flue insulation, the hinge mechanism on the folded table. She worked the way she had worked on her best projects. Not because someone was paying her, not because there was a deadline, because the thing in front of her demanded proper attention and she was capable of giving it. At some point she realized she was talking to Thomas Hale, not out loud, mostly, but internally, in the way you addressed a collaborator whose judgment you had come to trust. She would look at a detail and think, why did you do it this way? And then she would look more carefully until she understood the reason. And the reason was always structural, always deliberate, always correct. The man had not made careless choices. Every decision in this space could be accounted for. She found the second compartment in the late afternoon. She had been checking the floor systematically, heel pressing each board, listening for the change in resonance that indicated a void. Most old floors had them, settling, shrinkage, just the way wood moved over decades. She was almost to the far end of the wagon bed when a board answered her heel with a distinctly different tone. Not the low, solid thud of earth-backed wood. Something hollow and intentional. She crouched, ran her fingers along the seams of the surrounding boards, found the slight gap where one panel was designed to lift rather than nail. Applied pressure. The panel shifted, lifted. The cavity below was dry, lined with a layer of flattened tin sheeting soldered at the joints. He had waterproofed it. Of course he had. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth, several items. She unwrapped them one by one and set each on the floor beside her. Silver coins, 12 of them, arranged in a small stack. A cloth pouch containing a ring, a small brooch with a design she couldn't fully make out in the low light, and a pair of earrings, simple gold hoops. A folded document she opened carefully and identified as a land claim form partially completed signed by Thomas Hale, dated September 1887, and beneath all of it another envelope. Smaller than the first. This one addressed not to whoever finds this but to James and Lily Hale, Portland, Oregon. She sat back on her heels. The letter to his children. He had written a letter to his children and sealed it, and hidden it here. Not in the same place as the drawings, a different place. Deliberately separate. The drawings were for whoever came. This was for them. She did not open it. She held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, which was slight. Paper and ink, and whatever a father had been able to find to say to the children he had sent away. She put it back in the cavity, set the coins and the jewelry and the land claim document back around it, replaced the oilcloth, lowered the panel, pressed it down until it seated properly, and sat on the floor next to the closed compartment and understood something. She had been thinking about this house as a thing to be discovered, as a remarkable artifact, as evidence of Thomas Hale's engineering mind and practical skill. All of that was true, but it was also more than that. The letter to the children, placed separately from the letter to the world. The jewelry that had belonged to Clara, kept safe. The land claim document filled out but never filed. These were not relics. These were the parts of a life that he had organized and protected and left exactly as carefully as he had built the walls. This was not a house that had been abandoned. This was a house that was still being inhabited. By intention. By decision. By the particular stubbornness of a man who had built something and believed it would matter, and had organized everything in his power to make sure that when the time came, whoever arrived would have what they needed to understand it. She sat on the floor as the light began to fade outside, and the stove ticked steadily, and the fallen tree lay across the path outside, and she thought about what it meant to build something with that kind of faith. Not faith in God or in fate, in the structure itself, in the quality of the work, in the reliability of wood and iron and proper angles to outlast the hands that shaped them. She thought about her own work, the buildings she had fought for, the reports she had written, the mornings she had stood in front of planning boards and said, "This structure wants to stand, you just have to let it." She thought about whether she had ever meant it the way Thomas Hale meant it. She thought she probably had. At the beginning, before the business of it had taken over, and the lists had multiplied, and the lists had multiplied, and the mornings had gotten quiet in ways she filled with coffee and project management, she got up off the floor. She tended the stove. She ate something. She sat at the table with the drawings and the letter and the notebook spread around her, and the small circle of her flashlight on the page, and she read the notebook from the beginning again, more slowly this time, paying attention to different things. She was still reading when the second night closed in around the wagon house and the forest went still and the embers glowed and the darkness outside was total and deep and completely without fear. Not because nothing bad had happened here, but because something true had. She left at first light. Not because the path was clear. It wasn't. The fallen tree still blocked the most obvious exit, and the ground beyond it was a rearranged version of what she had walked in on, wet and uncertain, and full of new gaps where old things had shifted. But she had her GPS. She had her training, and she had spent 2 nights in a house built by a man who understood that staying still was sometimes the right strategy, and moving was sometimes the only one. This was a moving morning. She packed everything except what belonged here. The coins stayed. The jewelry stayed. The land claim document stayed. The letter to James and Lily stayed in its compartment beneath the floor, sealed exactly as Thomas had left it. She replaced the panel, pressed it down, ran her hand across the surface once. The drawings she kept. The letter addressed to whoever finds this she kept. The notebook she kept. Not because they were hers, because they needed to go somewhere they could be understood. And she was, at this precise moment in history, the person most qualified to take them there. She photographed the interior one final time. Every wall, every joint, the stove, the carved engineering notes, the roof line from the doorway, the wheels half buried in the earth outside. She took 47 photographs and then stood in the doorway and took one more with nothing technical in mind. Just the space, just the quality of the morning light on old wood. Then she pulled the door closed. She did not latch it. Somehow that felt wrong, like locking a place that had chosen to be open. She turned and found her way through the fallen debris of the storm. It took her 2.5 hours to reach the trailhead. Not 2.5 hours of easy walking. 2.5 hours of picking her way over and around, and sometimes through things that had not been there 3 days ago. The trail was an archaeology project now, layers of before and after stacked on top of each other, and she read it the way she read old structures, patiently, looking for what was solid beneath what had changed. She was 3/4 of the way out when she heard voices, male voices, multiple, moving in her direction with the kind of coordinated efficiency that meant they were looking for something specific, or someone. She stepped around a downed branch and into a clearing, and found herself facing 2 men in orange vests over ranger jackets, both holding radios, both stopping when they saw her. The younger one said something into his radio immediately. She caught her own name. The older one, closer to 50, with a weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor work, looked at her with the expression of a man who had been doing this job long enough to feel relief before he felt irritation. Deputy Cal Britton. She learned his name 30 seconds later when he introduced himself with the flat courtesy of someone who had spent 2 days organizing a search and was very glad it was over and was also going to have some questions. Miss Calloway, that's me. You've been out here since Tuesday. I have. The weather was significant, it was. He looked at her. At the state of her jacket, which had done its job but showed the evidence. At the pack on her back, which was full in a way that suggested she had found shelter, rather than spent 2 nights under a tree. At the particular quality of her expression, which she was aware, was not the expression of a person who had been through an ordeal. It was the expression of a person who had been through something, but something entirely different. Are you injured? No. Are you in need of medical attention? No. Do you need water? Food? I'm fine. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, in the tone of someone deciding to save the longer conversation for later, there's a vehicle at the trailhead. We can debrief there. I need to make a call first, she said. Miss Calloway. It's important. She was already pulling out her phone. Give me 10 minutes. She stepped to the side of the clearing and dialed the number from the card she had kept in her jacket pocket for 3 days. Raymond Greer picked up on the second ring. This is Greer. Dr. Greer. This is Meg Calloway. We met at the trailhead on Tuesday. A pause. Then the preservation architect. Yes. She looked back at the 2 men in orange vests who were pretending not to watch her. I found something. Another pause. Longer. Straight lines, he said. Right angles, she said. And a lot more than that. He was at the ranger station before she finished her debrief with Britton. She saw him through the window of the small building, standing in the parking lot beside an older model pickup truck, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the tree line with the patience of someone who had been looking at tree lines for a very long time. When she came outside, he turned immediately, not urgently, just with complete attention. She handed him the drawings before she said anything else. He took them carefully, unrolled the first one, looked at it. His face did the thing she had noticed before in the parking lot, that slight adjustment, except this time it was not a crack in a door. This was the door opening all the way. Thomas Hale, he said quietly. She looked at him. You know the name. I know the land claim. He rolled the drawing carefully and held it with both hands. September 1887. Parcel in the Northern Corridor. The filing showed up in the county records about 12 years ago when they digitized the old ledgers, but the physical file was missing. The claim was never finalized. It just stopped. He looked at her, and the structure itself was never documented. Until now, she said, until now. He looked at the drawings again, then at her. How bad is the access? A significant tree came down across the main path, but there are ways around it. The structure itself is intact, completely intact. She paused. Dr. Greer, those drawings. Do you know what he was describing? Tell me what you think you see, she told him. She talked for 7 minutes without stopping. Load distribution, thermal regulation, the flue design, the joint work, the roofline calculation, the way the wagon frame had been integrated structurally rather than just enclosed. The fact that the system he had built was not a survival hack but an original design that could be documented, reproduced, and understood by any competent structural engineer. Greer listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. I've been looking for this site for 11 years, he said. I know. You told me. I didn't expect it to be like this. No, she said. Neither did I. The phone calls started that afternoon. Greer made 2, then 3. By the time Meg had eaten something that wasn't from her trail pack and changed into the spare clothes in her car, he had the chair of the Washington State Historical Society on the line and was using the kind of careful, precise language that professional historians used when they had found something significant, and they had found something and did not want to overstate it, and also could not quite prevent the energy underneath the words from being completely obvious. She sat in the passenger seat of his truck and listened and looked at the photographs on her phone and thought about the letter. Not for my name, for the work. She pulled out her own notebook and wrote that down. Not because she would forget it, because writing it felt like a commitment. She also wrote, in smaller letters beneath it, what am I building, and does it have proper attention to its own forces? She was staring at that question when Greer ended his call and turned to her. They want to see the drawings today. Good. And they're going to want to talk to you extensively. Also good. He looked at her. You're taking this very calmly. She thought about that. I've been inside the thing, she said. Once you understand what it actually is, calm feels like the right response. The Washington State Historical Society's main office was in a brick building that had itself been preserved twice, she noticed, and had been done reasonably well both times. The entry had been updated without erasing the original molding. Someone had cared. She and Greer arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon. By 4:45 there were 6 people in the room. By 5:15 there were 9. She laid the drawings on the conference table and unrolled them carefully, and stepped back and let the people in the room look. She watched their faces. She had gotten good at watching faces in planning board meetings, in client presentations, in the long patient work of convincing institutions that old things had value. She knew what skepticism looked like, and she knew what genuine recognition looked like, and what was in the room right now was neither. What was in the room was the specific expression of people encountering something they had not expected to exist. A structural engineer named Paul Whitmer, mid-50s, who had been brought in on the second phone call, crouched over the drawings with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and then pulled down over his eyes and then pushed up again in rapid alternation as he moved between sections. This flue calculation, he said, not really to anyone. This is not standard for the period. No, Meg said. This is not standard for 20 years after the period, I know. He looked up at her. Who was this man? A builder from Ohio. He came west in 1887. His wife died that winter. He sent his children ahead in the spring and stayed behind to finish the design. Whitmer looked back at the drawings. He stayed behind to finish this. Yes. A silence fell over the room that had a specific texture, the texture of people adjusting their understanding of something. The director of the society, a woman in her 60s named Barbara Stern, who had the direct manner of someone who had spent decades deciding what mattered, looked at Meg over the drawings. You left the ancillary materials in the structure? The materials that belonged to the family, yes. The drawings and the letter addressed to finders I brought out. There's also a compartment containing personal property, including what appears to be a partially completed land claim. The Hale land claim, Greer said. He had been quiet since they arrived, letting Meg carry the presentation. Now he placed a printout on the table beside the drawings. I pulled this from the digitized records 12 years ago and could never connect it to a physical site. The filing was made in September 1887. It was never finalized. The original physical file is missing from the county archive, along with a number of other claims from the same period. Barbara Stern looked at the printout, then at Greer. Missing how? That's a question I've been trying to answer for a while, Greer said. The short version is that a land acquisition process in 1902 appears to have involved a number of unfiled or incomplete claims in the northern corridor being cleared from the record. The company doing the acquiring was a timber operation. Most of the claimants had either died or moved on. Thomas Hale had no known survivors at the time. He did have survivors, Meg said. Everyone looked at her. He had 2 children, James and Lily. He sent them to Portland in March of 1888. He wrote about it in the notebook. She paused. There's also a letter in the sealed compartment, addressed to them specifically. I didn't open it. The room was quiet again. Then Barbara Stern said, "Why not?" Meg thought about how to answer that. "Because it wasn't addressed to me," she said. Stern looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone who had just added a data point to an ongoing assessment. "We'll need a full site survey," she said. "Structural documentation before anything is moved or disturbed, and we need to identify any existing heirs." "Working on both," Greer said. Warren Slade called Meg's cell phone at 8 o'clock that evening while she was sitting in a diner 2 blocks from the Historical Society, eating the first proper meal she'd had in 3 days. She didn't know the number. She almost didn't pick up. She picked up. "Miss Calloway, my name is Warren Slade. I'm a private preservation consultant. I understand you've made a rather remarkable discovery in the Olympic Peninsula corridor." She put down her fork. "Who told you that?" "This is a small world, Miss Calloway. Preservation circles especially." A pause. The specific pause of someone measuring how much warmth to deploy. "I'd love to have a conversation about the site. I represent a group of investors who are deeply committed to frontier heritage and would be very interested in ensuring this particular find receives the resources it deserves." She looked at her food. She had been hungry 30 seconds ago. "What kind of resources?" she said. "Significant ones. Acquisition, restoration, interpretation. A proper facility. This kind of discovery deserves more than a county historical society's operating budget." The warmth in his voice was professional grade. It had the quality of something that had been carefully calibrated over many applications. "What's the name of the investment group?" she said. "It operates under several entities depending on the project." "Give me one." A brief pause. "Cascade Heritage Partners." She wrote the name on a napkin. "Mr. Slade," she said, "I appreciate the call. I'm not the decision maker on this. The Washington State Historical Society is the appropriate contact." Of course. Though I'd point out that the person who found the site has a certain natural authority in how it proceeds. That's not how preservation law works." "No," he agreed pleasantly, "but it's how human situations work." She ended the call. She picked up her fork. She ate 3 more bites and then put the fork down again and got out her phone and searched Cascade Heritage Partners. The results took a moment to populate. When they did, she read them carefully. The company existed, incorporated in Washington State 6 years ago, listed as a heritage preservation and real estate development consultation firm. The board included several names she didn't recognize. The registered agent address was in Bellevue. She searched the address. It appeared in connection with 3 other companies. One was a standard property development firm. One was a legal consulting group. One was a company called Ridgeline Resource Management, which described itself as a natural resource advisory service. Natural resource. She stared at that for a moment. Then she searched Ridgeline Resource Management and Olympic Peninsula. It took 2 searches to find what she was looking for. A public comment filing from 14 months ago, submitted to the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, opposing a proposed heritage corridor designation in the northern Olympic Peninsula on the grounds that such a designation would interfere with ongoing resource assessment activities in the area. The filing was signed by Ridgeline Resource Management. The area described in the filing included the corridor where she had found the Wagon house. She sat in the diner with the napkin that said Cascade Heritage Partners and her half-eaten dinner, and a very specific feeling that she had assessed a structure incorrectly once before in her professional life and had no intention of doing it again. She called Greer at 8:45. "I know who Slade is," Greer said before she finished explaining. "Then why didn't you say something at the meeting?" "Because I didn't know he'd move this fast." A pause. "He's been tracking the northern corridor for 2 years. There's a resource assessment ongoing in that area. Timber initially, and then something else. The designation question is still open." Another pause. "If the Wagon House site becomes a documented heritage landmark, the corridor designation moves forward. Slade's group loses access to a significant portion of the assessment area." She let that settle. "So he wants to get in front of the story," she said. "Control the narrative. Frame it as a private preservation effort rather than a public heritage designation. If the site goes into a private facility, the heritage corridor argument loses its anchor. That's why he called me specifically. You're the finder. If you endorse his involvement, it carries weight." She looked at the napkin. "He's not getting my endorsement," she said. "I know," Greer said. "I didn't think he would. But I needed you to understand what the actual situation is before he got a second chance to explain it to you his way." She folded the napkin in half, then in quarters. Then she set it on the plate next to her unfinished dinner. "Thomas Hale filed that land claim in 1887, she said. "It was never processed. His children went to Portland in March of 1888. If they had descendants, those descendants theoretically have a standing interest in the claim." "Theoretically" is doing some work in that sentence, Greer said. "Land claims from that period have extremely complicated legal histories. But yes, the existence of documented heirs would matter. Are you looking?" "I've been looking for 11 years for the site," he said. "Finding the family won't take nearly as long." It took him 4 days. She knew it was 4 days because she spent those 4 days in her office, not avoiding anything. Working. She had materials to document, photographs to organize, a formal site report to begin drafting that would meet the standards required for official heritage designation. She had her field notes from 2 days of impromptu surveying and 47 photographs and the measurements she had taken and the sketches she had made, and a working knowledge of the structure that was, at this moment, more complete than anyone else's. She also had the contract from the Hartwell Group still in its folder on her desk. She had not looked at it once. Slade called twice more. She let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were polite and slightly less warm than the first call, the calibration shifting in small increments. She listened to them both and did not call back. On the 4th day, Greer called at 7 in the morning. "I found her," he said. "Her, Audrey Hale Crofton. 69 years old. She's in Salem, Oregon. She's the great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Hale through his son James." A pause. She didn't know about the Wagon house. Meg sat down slowly in her desk chair. "Does she know now?" "She knows someone found something connected to her family's history and that I'd like to speak with her. That's all I told her." Another pause. "She's coming up this weekend." Meg looked at the folder on her desk. "Greer," she said. "Yes." The letter in the compartment. The one addressed to James and Lily. "Yes, she should be there when it's opened." A long pause. "Yes," he said, "she should." Audrey Hale Crofton arrived on Saturday morning in a silver sedan that had a small dent in the passenger door and a back seat full of what appeared to be boxes of documents, which Meg noticed through the window and found immediately interesting. She was 69 and looked it, not in a diminished way, but in the way of someone who had lived fully enough that their face had recorded it. White hair cut short, practical clothes. The hands of someone who had spent time working with them. She got out of the car and looked at the Historical Society building, and then at Meg and Greer waiting on the steps, and her expression was careful, contained, the expression of someone who had learned not to show too much until they understood what they were showing it to. Meg knew that expression. She owned it herself. "Miss Hale Crofton," Greer said. "Thank you for making the trip, Audrey," she said. "I don't use Hale Crofton for things that matter." She looked at Meg. "You're the one who found it." Yes, Audrey looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "What was it like, inside? Not what did you find? Not what is it worth? What was it like?" Meg thought about how to answer that honestly. "Careful," she said. Everything in it was careful. Something moved across Audrey's face fast, then contained again. "That sounds like what I've been told about him," she said. "Come on then. Show me what you have." They went inside. Meg laid out the drawings first. Then the letter addressed to whoever finds this. Then the photographs, organized chronologically, the exterior first, and then moving through the interior systematically. She explained what she was showing as she went, keeping the technical language accessible, watching Audrey's face the way she watched faces in planning board meetings. Except this was different, because this was not a planning board. This was a woman in her late 60s, sitting in a conference room in a building she had never been in before, looking at documentation of a place her ancestor had built and died in, which she had not known existed until 4 days ago. Audrey was quiet through all of it. She asked 2 questions, both technical. What was the estimated date of the final structural additions based on the timber age? And whether the flue insulation was original to the first build or a later modification. Both questions told Meg something about the kind of attention Audrey brought to information. When Meg finished, Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the bag she had brought and produced a box. Shoebox-sized. Old. The kind of box that had been repurposed many times over decades. "My grandmother kept this," she said. "Her father gave it to her. His name was James. He was Thomas Hale's son." She opened the box. Inside, on top of a collection of papers and photographs and folded documents, was a letter. The envelope was old and had been handled many times, the corners soft and the flap long since separated, held together now by age and habit rather than glue. Meg looked at the writing on the front. It was Thomas Hale's hand. She knew it immediately. The same pressure, the same slight forward slant, the same way he formed the letter H. The letter was addressed to James Hale, Portland, Oregon. There was no street address, just the city and the state and the name. "He sent it," she said. Audrey looked up. "He sent a copy," Meg said. "The letter in the compartment. He wrote 2. He sent one and he hid one." She looked at Audrey. "Did it reach him? Did James receive it?" "He received it in 1891, Audrey said. "He kept it his entire life. My grandmother memorized it. She could recite it." A pause. "James went back in 1903 to find his father. He didn't find the house. The trail had changed. He wrote about it," he said. "He walked the corridor for 3 days and found nothing, and came back to Portland and never went again." Meg sat with that for a moment. James had gone back. He had walked the same corridor, and the wagon house had been there, exactly where his father had left it, and he had not found it, because you couldn't find it if you didn't know to look for right angles. "Your grandmother," Meg said. What did she know about Thomas? About what he was building? She knew he was a builder, that he was good at it, that he had stayed behind to finish something and had written that he intended to come out when it was done. Audrey paused. "He didn't come out?" "No. My grandmother always said he hadn't failed. She was very specific about that. She said he had finished something and then he had stayed with it." Audrey looked at the drawings. "I didn't know what that meant until now." The room was quiet. Outside, traffic moved on the street, a normal Saturday. People going to normal places for normal reasons, without any awareness that in a conference room in a brick building that had been preserved twice, a woman was looking at drawings her great-great-grandfather had made alone in a forest in 1888, and understanding for the first time what he had actually done there. Slade called Meg's phone during the lunch break. She looked at the screen, let it ring, put the phone back in her pocket. Greer had stepped out and was on his own call, and Meg could see through the window that his body language was the body language of someone delivering news that was going well. She turned back to Audrey. "There's going to be some pressure," Meg said, "from outside interests. People who want to be involved in how this is handled." Audrey looked at her steadily. "What kind of people?" the kind who are interested in what's around the site as much as the site itself. A pause. What's around it? That's still being determined. But the short version is that someone is trying to get in front of this story before it becomes official heritage designation. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Thomas spent his last years making sure something he built would last and be found and be understood. He didn't hide it because he was afraid. He documented it because he believed it mattered. Another pause. No one is buying that story. Meg looked at her. No, she said, they're not. Audrey reached into the box and produced another document. A photocopy, worn at the folds. She slid it across the table. James's son, my grandfather, spent 20 years trying to establish the land claim, she said. It never went anywhere. The original filing had disappeared, and without it there was nothing to prove Thomas had ever been there. She tapped the photocopy. He kept everything he could find. Every piece of paper that touched the name Hale in that county during that period. Meg looked at the document. It was a record of correspondence. Letters sent from James Hale to the county land office. Dated between 1910 and 1929. Request after request for information about the original filing. Each one answered with a variation of the same response, no record found. He knew it had been there, Audrey said. He just couldn't prove it. Meg looked at the photocopy for a long moment. Then she looked up at the drawings on the table. The ones Thomas had made in 1888 and sealed in a tin canister in a hidden compartment in the floor of a wagon house that no one had found for 136 years. He had not just been preserving a design. He had been preserving proof. The land claim was in the other compartment. Signed, dated September 1887, in Thomas Hale's own hand. Alongside his wife's jewelry and his children's letter, and everything else he had decided was worth protecting. Greer, she said, even though he wasn't in the room. She was already reaching for her phone. The land claim changed everything. Not immediately. Nothing in preservation work happened immediately. But it changed the shape of what was possible, and that was its own kind of immediate. Greer had a contact at the Washington State Archives who owed him a professional favor from a disputed courthouse renovation project 8 years prior. He called that contact the same afternoon Audrey produced the correspondence file. The archivist, a methodical woman named Carol Petch, who apparently did not believe in phone greetings and simply began speaking the moment the call connected, confirmed within 40 minutes that the Hale land claim had indeed been entered into the county ledger in September of 1887. The entry existed in the digitized record. The physical file, as Greer had long known, was absent, but the digitized entry contained a reference number, and that reference number appeared in one other place in the county archive. A transfer log from 1902. Part of a bulk administrative action described in the ledger as consolidation of incomplete claims, Northern Corridor parcels. Consolidation. Meg looked at that word for a long time when Greer read it to her. It was a very clean word for what it appeared to have been. The legal situation was, as attorneys like to say, complex. She learned this from a woman named Helen Marsh, a property and heritage law specialist out of Seattle, who Greer had worked with before, and who arrived at the Historical Society on Monday morning with a rolling briefcase and the focused energy of someone who had spent 20 years untangling exactly this category of complicated. Helen was 53. She had the manner of someone who had been underestimated often enough that she had stopped performing patience about it. She sat down at the conference table, opened her briefcase, looked at the documents Meg spread before her, and began asking questions. Specific ones in a specific order, the questions of someone building an argument in real time. Meg answered each one. Helen made notes. She did not look up while she made them. The digitized ledger entry establishes that the claim was filed, Helen said. Still writing. The transfer log establishes that it was administratively closed in 1902. The question is whether that closure was procedurally valid. Was it? Meg said. Helen looked up, almost certainly not entirely. The administrative process used in 1902 required individual notification of each claimant or verified surviving heir. There is no evidence that was done. She paused. There is, however, the matter of 122 years of subsequent land use, ownership transfers, and legal arrangements that have occurred on the basis of the closure being valid. So it's complicated, significantly complicated. But complicated is not the same as unwinnable. And more relevantly, it is not the same as unimportant. She looked back at her notes. The land claim itself may not be resolvable in a way that benefits the Hale heirs materially, but the documentation you've recovered establishes several things that are independently significant. She ticked them off without looking up from the page. Thomas Hale was physically present on and actively developing the parcel as of September 1887. His wife died on the parcel in December of that year. His children were present until March of 1888. He continued to occupy and develop the parcel beyond that date. He filed a land claim with the county. That claim was closed without proper notification under the applicable law of the period. That is a historical record, Helen said. It may not translate into a modern property remedy, but it translates into an accurate historical record of what happened. And in the context of a heritage designation process, accurate historical record is exactly what matters. Meg looked at Audrey, who sat at the far end of the table with the shoebox in front of her, and the expression of someone listening very carefully to a conversation she had been waiting decades to be part of. What does it mean for the designation? Meg said. It means the site has a documented human history that is specific, verifiable, and legally on record. That makes the heritage case substantially stronger. Helen paused. It also means the corridor argument against designation becomes significantly more difficult to sustain, since the heritage record now includes not just the structure, but the land use history underlying it. Slade called Meg that evening for the fourth time. She picked up. Miss Calloway. The warmth had recalibrated again. Less this time. More direct. I understand there's been some legal consultation. That's correct. I want to be clear that my group's interest here is genuinely in preservation. Whatever you may have heard about related activities in the corridor, Mr. Slade, she said. Yes, I've read the DNR filing. A pause. Not a short one. Then you know that Ridgeline's interests are resource assessment only. That's entirely separate from. I know that a heritage corridor designation would affect those interests, she said. And I know that you called me specifically because you wanted to be involved in how this site's story was told before the designation process moved forward. Silence. I'm not going to help you with that, she said. Another pause. Longer. The Historical Society doesn't have the resources to do this properly, he said. The warmth was gone now. What remained was more honest, if not more pleasant. Private funding would move this forward faster, with more impact. With more control, she said. He didn't answer that. Thomas Hale wrote a letter to whoever found his work, she said. He was very specific about what he wanted. He wanted the work to reach someone who could use it, not someone who could own it. She paused. Have a good evening, Mr. Slade. She hung up. She sat in her car in the parking lot of the Historical Society and looked at the steering wheel for a moment. She thought about the list she had not made. The one that should have existed for this decision, pros and cons, 2 columns, careful handwriting. She had not made it, because she already knew the answer, and for once she had caught up to it before she needed the list to get there. She started the car. The site survey team went in the following Thursday. Meg went with them. 5 people, including a structural engineer named Doug Farrell, who had a reputation for old buildings, and a habit of crouching very close to things and breathing audibly while he thought. She decided she liked him within the first 20 minutes. He looked at the mortise joints in the wagon house corners and made a sound like someone had done something personally impressive to him. The path was still difficult. The fallen tree had been partially cleared by a volunteer crew on the Tuesday before. Enough to get through with equipment, though the ground was still wet and the footing unreliable in places. She led them in. She had walked it in a storm. She could walk it in November sun. The wagon house looked different in full daylight. She had known it would. She had prepared herself for it. But still, coming through the last stand of trees and into the clearing, and seeing it there, fully visible, the roof intact, the morning light on the dark wood, she stopped before she was ready to move again. Not because it was beautiful. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was serious. The kind of structure that asked something of the people who looked at it. Doug Farrell stopped beside her. "Huh," he said. Which covered it, she thought. They spent 6 hours on the site. Doug spent most of that time on the structural assessment. He moved through the interior with the systematic care of someone who understood that his analysis would become part of a permanent record. He documented the joint work, the load path of the roof structure, the thermal properties of the wall assembly, the flue system, the floor construction. He photographed everything and measured everything and filled an entire field book before they left. At one point, he called her over to look at something in the wall construction near the northern corner. She crouched beside him. He pointed to a section of the timber frame where 2 logs met in a joint slightly different from the others she had seen. Not worse. Different. He modified this one, Doug said. Mid-construction? After. Look at the color variation in the wood. This log was added later. The joint is a different type. He switched from a dovetail to a housed joint here. She looked carefully. He was right. The color was slightly lighter on the added log, and the joint was indeed a different form, more sophisticated. He identified a problem in the original design and corrected it, she said. That's my read. Doug sat back on his heels, which means he was here long enough to observe the structure through at least one full winter cycle. Long enough to see how it performed and make adjustments. He looked at the joint. That's not a man who built something and walked away. No, she said, it's not. She was near the back of the site when she heard Doug's voice from the direction of the far end of the wagon bed. Calloway. Not alarm. Something else, she went. He was kneeling beside the wooden frame at the far interior end, the section she had examined less thoroughly during her own days there. He had a small folding inspection mirror extended into a gap between the floor and the lower frame rail. There's a void here, he said. Different from the compartments you documented. She crouched beside him. Different how? He adjusted the mirror. The construction is different. The other compartments are storage. This one. He paused. This one has a work surface. She went still. Show me how to get in. It took them 12 minutes to find the access panel. Not in the floor. In the lower section of the end wall, a panel that looked like structural infill, the same timber as the surrounding wall, the same finish, nothing to distinguish it visually. But when Doug pressed the lower left corner in a specific way, the right side lifted slightly on a hidden pivot. The space inside was narrow, deep, like a cabinet turned on its side. A folding surface extended on small hinges, collapsed flat but clearly designed to open. A shallow tray built into the back held items still in position after 137 years. Small tools, a compass, a folding rule, a set of drawing instruments in a fitted case, each piece nested in its shaped slot, and on the folding surface itself, face down, a single sheet of paper. She reached in carefully and lifted it, turned it over. It was a drawing, more refined than the 3 sheets from the tin canister. The lines cleaner, the notation more complete. A full section cut through the wagon house, showing every layer from the floor to the roof peak, every material annotated, every dimension noted, every structural decision labeled with its reasoning in the small, careful handwriting she knew as well now as her own. In the lower right corner, the title block, Thomas Hale, Aldridge Mobile Dwelling System Revised, 1889. Revised. He had kept working. After Clara died in December 1887, after the children left in March of 1888. Through the following year he had kept developing the design, kept refining it, kept making it better, and he had kept it here, in this small hidden workspace, where he returned to the thing he believed was worth finishing. She looked at the bottom of the drawing, below the title block, a note, added in ink slightly different from the main drawing, written at a different time when he had finally decided what needed to be said. For James. For Lily. So they know their father was not a man who gave up. She sat on the floor of the wagon house with that piece of paper in her hands, and the winter light coming through the small window and the sound of the survey team moving outside. And she was not a preservation architect in that moment. Not a recently divorced woman with an unread contract on her desk. She was just a person holding something true. She brought the drawing out carefully, showed it to Doug. He read the note at the bottom. He handed it back without saying anything, which was exactly right. She photographed it in position before anything was moved, then laid it alongside the other materials and stood back and looked at the complete picture of what Thomas Hale had left behind. The original drawings, the letter addressed to whoever finds this, the notebook, the sealed compartments with the family materials, the revised drawing in the hidden workspace. He had not just been surviving. He had not just been documenting. He had been teaching. Every piece arranged and preserved with enough redundancy that if one thing was missed, something else would still carry the story. The same instinct that had made him write the stove instructions on the wall, where anyone who needed them would find them. The same instinct that had made him calculate the roof pitch and write the angle down for whoever came next. He had thought about that person, built for that person, written for that person. And then he had died in a forest in Washington state, and the forest had held his work for 137 years, until a woman with a trail map and an unread contract had gotten lost in a November storm. She thought about that on the drive back, the particular randomness of it. She had chosen that trail because it was unremarkable, because nothing was supposed to happen, because she needed 3 days to think about a decision she already knew the answer to and wasn't ready to say out loud yet. She had not been ready for any of this either. But here it was. The formal heritage designation application was submitted in December. Helen Marsh filed the legal brief regarding the land claim history the same week. 2 historians from the University of Washington submitted supplementary documentation on the engineering significance of the Aldridge mobile dwelling system. Doug Farrell's structural report ran to 64 pages and included in its introduction a paragraph that was not standard engineering report language. She noticed it and read it twice. He had written, in 40 years of structural assessment work, I have encountered perhaps 3 examples of intuitive engineering thinking of this quality. What is remarkable here is not only the correctness of the design decisions, but the evidence that they were continuously revised and improved over time. This is not the work of a man who built something and stopped thinking about it. This is the work of an engineer, Thomas Hale, described as an engineer, by a structural engineer with 40 years of practice. She called Doug and thanked him for the report. I just wrote what was there, he said. The introduction wasn't standard. A pause. No, he said. It wasn't. Another pause. Some things deserve to be said plainly. Slade made one more attempt, not through phone calls. He submitted a formal objection to the heritage designation process, citing procedural questions about the documentation chain of custody and the legal status of the recovered materials. It was filed correctly. The Historical Society's legal team, with Helen's assistance, responded correctly. The objection was reviewed and dismissed. 3 weeks later, the notice came that the initial designation review had found sufficient grounds to proceed. The Northern Corridor Heritage designation would move to the next stage of evaluation. Pending that evaluation, the site would be protected from development activity. Slade's group did not respond publicly. Ridgeline Resource Management filed a notice of withdrawal from the corridor assessment area 2 months after that. Greer forwarded the notice to her with a 1-line message. The message said, "Thought you should see this." She wrote back, "I see it." He wrote back, "Good work." She held her phone for a moment after that exchange and thought that good work was probably the best thing Raymond Greer knew how to say, and that it was enough. The question of moving the Wagon house generated the most discussion. More than the designation, more than the legal question, more than the drawings and their engineering significance. Because moving it felt wrong to some people. She understood that. She felt it herself. The house had chosen stillness. Thomas had built it to stay. Moving it seemed like a violation of something, even if she couldn't name it precisely. She sat with that feeling for 2 weeks. Then she read something in the notebook she had not properly absorbed the first 3 times through. It was a late entry, after Clara died, after the children had gone, after the joint modification. He had written about the original wagon, the one the house was built on, about the specific October morning when he had looked at Clara and looked at the terrain and looked at the sky and made the decision to stop. He had written, "The wagon did not fail. We asked it to stop." She read that line and sat with it for a long time. The wagon did not fail. We asked it to stop. Stopping had been the strategy, not the destination. The wagon had always been capable of moving. Thomas had asked it to be still, because stillness was what was needed then, which meant moving it now was not a contradiction. It was a continuation. She called Greer. "Move it," she said. "I thought you were conflicted." I was. She looked at the notebook open on her desk. The wagon didn't stop because it couldn't move. It stopped because he needed it to. Moving it now is the next thing he would have asked it to do. He just couldn't ask it himself. Greer was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a useful thing to say publicly," he said. "Then say it," she said. The extraction took 3 days. The first day was preparation. The team cleared the earth carefully from around the wheels, working by hand where they needed to, exposing the iron rims and the axles and the full extent of what had been buried for over a century. She watched from a distance and then from closer. The wheels were extraordinary. 137 years in the earth and the ironwork held. Corroded, yes. Changed by time, yes. But the essential structure of them intact. She thought about what it meant to build something iron-rimmed. Built to roll. Built to take weight. Built to keep going. The second day was stabilization. Temporary supports added under the frame. Not replacing the original structure. Working alongside it. The engineer in charge explained each decision to her before making it, which she had requested, and which he agreed to without complaint, understanding correctly that her knowledge of this structure matched his. The third day was the lift. She was there at 6 in the morning. The forest was cold and still, the kind of November stillness that had actual weight. She stood in the clearing and watched the preparation, and did not try to be calm about it, because calm felt dishonest. Audrey was there too. She had driven up from Salem the night before. She stood on the other side of the clearing in a heavy coat, with her hands in her pockets, and her attention entirely on the wagon house. They had not spoken yet that morning. They did not need to. The cables went taut at 8:47. The tension built slowly, the way real forces always worked, without announcing themselves. She watched the ground around the wheels, watched the grass that had grown against the lower frame for decades beyond counting. And then the wagon house moved. Not dramatically, not with a lurch or anything cinematic. It lifted with the quiet dignity of a structure that had been properly supported and properly asked. The wheels came free of the earth in dark clumps, roots that had woven through the iron spokes over decades, let go one by one, small sounds, not violent. Just the sound of things releasing what they had been holding. The wagon house was in the air. For approximately 4 seconds, it was neither in the forest nor in the world beyond it. It was between. She was crying. She knew because her vision had gone slightly blurred, and there was a tightness in her chest she recognized as the real thing rather than the cold. She let it happen. She was not embarrassed about it. She looked across the clearing. Audrey was not embarrassed about it either. They did not look away from each other. The wagon house came down onto the transport platform with the care of something that had earned its handling. Strapped, secured, ready for the road, she thought. Thomas asked it to stop, and it stopped, and now it's moving again. And that's not a betrayal. That's exactly what he built it to do. The museum had prepared for it. She had been involved in those preparations, which meant she could argue for certain decisions, and she argued well. The space was climate-controlled, the floors reinforced to handle the load, the lighting designed to show the grain of the wood and the age of the iron and the quality of the joints without washing any of it into flatness. The kind of light that said, "Look at this carefully, because it will reward you." The wagon house arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. It was rolled into position. The straps came off. It stood, just stood, under its own structure, in a new place, the same as it had always been. She stood in the doorway of the museum space and looked at it from across the room and understood something she had been circling for months. The wagon house had not been waiting to be rescued. It had been waiting to be understood. Those were two entirely different things, and Thomas had always known the difference. He had not written his letters in despair. He had written them in the specific patience of a man who understood that good work did not need saving. It needed finding, and that eventually, given enough time, A structure built with proper attention to its own forces would be found by someone capable of recognizing it. She had been that person, not because she was exceptional, because she had shown up, because she had walked into a forest in a storm and then walked back out carrying what she found, because she had been paying attention. That was all it had ever required. The opening was on a Saturday in January, which was not the most hospitable month for an opening, but it was the right month for this particular story. January was the month you counted what had made it through the winter, what was still standing, what had held. People came, more than she expected. The space filled steadily through the morning. She stood near the back and watched. She watched a man in his 70s spend a long time in front of the engineering drawings, not moving, not taking photographs, just reading, the way people read when something is actually going in. She watched a woman about her own age read Thomas's letter, the one addressed to whoever finds this, displayed in full, alongside a careful transcription. Watched her read it once, then fold her arms across her chest in the way people did when something landed somewhere it wasn't entirely prepared for. She watched two children press their faces close to the glass to see the tools in the recovered workshop case, the drawing instruments, the folding rule, each piece nested in its shaped slot, exactly as Thomas had left it. One of them, a girl of about 8, turned to the woman beside her. Did he make those himself? The woman looked at the case. The tools? No. But he used them to make everything else. The girl considered that. That's still good, she said. Meg turned away before she gave herself away completely. Audrey found her by the back wall at mid-morning. She had a cup of coffee that someone had given her and was holding it with both hands. She looked at the Wagon house the way she had looked at everything connected to Thomas since the first day she walked into the conference room, with the focused attention of someone still absorbing. My grandmother used to say he was a man who finished things, Audrey said. Meg didn't say anything. She meant it as a comfort. She said it to explain why he hadn't come back. He finished what he started and then he was done. A pause. I always thought she was being generous, making a better story than the truth, and Meg said. Audrey looked at the Wagon house. Now I think she was just right, she said quietly. He was a man who finished things. He finished this. He just couldn't carry it out himself. They stood there for a moment. You did, Audrey said. I found it, Meg said. That's different. Audrey looked at her. The direct look of someone who had driven up from Salem with a shoebox of correspondence and sat in a conference room and opened a letter that had been sealed for 137 years and read it out loud in a steady voice. Is it? Audrey said. Meg thought about the trail she had chosen for its silence. The storm, the right angle in the forest. The stove instructions carved into the wood by hands that had been still for over a century. The tin canister. The hidden workspace. The revised drawing on the folding table. For James. For Lily. So they know their father was not a man who gave up. She thought about the folder that had been on her desk. The 42 pages. The title that sounded important at dinner parties. She thought about the morning she had driven north, with that folder untouched in her bag and a trail map she had printed 3 weeks earlier and kept under things so she didn't have to look at it. She thought about what she had been building for the last 20 years and whether it had proper attention to its own forces. And she thought about Thomas Hale at his folding work surface, in the hidden end of the Wagon house, drawing lines that might never be seen, still working. Not because anyone was watching, not because he was certain of the outcome, but because the work itself was the answer to the question of how to live with uncertainty. You built what was in front of you. You built it with attention. You wrote what you knew on the wall where someone might find it, and then you trusted the structure to do what a good structure did, which was last. No, she said to Audrey. I don't think it's different at all. Audrey nodded, looked back at the Wagon house. A boy of about 8 was standing in front of it now, hands in his pockets, head tilted to one side. His mother stood beside him. He looked at the wheels, the ones that had been in the ground for so long the roots had grown through the spokes, now cleaned and preserved but not restored, kept as they had been found. Why did he build it? The boy said. His mother started to answer, stopped. She looked at the Wagon house, and she didn't have the answer, and she knew she didn't, and she was honest about it. Meg was close enough to hear. She turned. Because he had people who needed to know he hadn't quit, she said. The boy looked at the wagon house for a moment, then he looked at her. Did they know? He said. She thought about Audrey, about the letter opened in the conference room, about a grandmother who had called Thomas a man who finished things and had been right about it in ways she couldn't have fully understood, about James, who had gone back to the forest in 1903 at 23 years old and walked the corridor for 3 days looking for his father and had not found the wagon house but had never stopped looking, and whose granddaughter had driven up from Salem the moment someone called with a shoebox of everything the family had kept. They had known. Not in time to tell him, but they had known. Eventually, she said. The boy looked back at the wagon house. Was it too late? He said. She looked at it too, at the iron wheels still holding their shape after everything the earth had done to them, at the joints, the dovetails and the one-housed joint Thomas had added when he saw how the original design performed under stress, and decided it could be better. At the door, open now, the interior visible, lit so that the marks on the wall were readable from where she stood, the stove instructions, the measurements, the working drawings carved directly into the wood by a man who needed a surface large enough to think on, and used what he had. At the roof, still at the angle he had calculated, still doing exactly what he had built it to do. No, she said. I don't think it was. The boy seemed satisfied with that. He turned back to the wagon house and kept looking at it with the serious attention children brought to things that interested them genuinely. The kind of attention that didn't perform itself, didn't explain itself, just was. His mother looked at Meg. A brief look, grateful and a little undone. The look of a parent watching their child encounter something real. Meg nodded once. Then she stepped back and let the room do what the room was built to do. Because that was the thing about a structure built with proper attention to its own forces. You did not need to stand beside it and explain it. You did not need to manage how people received it or guide them toward the correct response. You built it right. You placed it where it could be seen. And then you stepped back. The work carried itself. Thomas had known that, had written it in the last line of the letter to his children, the line that James had memorized and passed to his daughter, and she had passed to hers. A structure built with proper attention to its own forces will outlast the hands that made it. He had not been speaking only about timber and iron. She understood that now, in a way, she had not fully understood when she first read the words on the floor of a wagon, with the storm pressing against the walls outside. He had been speaking about the decision to build carefully in the first place. About the discipline of giving full attention to the thing in front of you, not the thing you wished was in front of you, or the thing that would be easier, or the thing that other people expected. The thing that was actually there, the work that was actually yours. She had found that here, not where she expected. Not in the quiet trail with no drama attached to it that she had chosen specifically so nothing would demand anything of her, but in a storm, in a clearing, in a right angle that had no business existing in old-growth forest, in a house that had been waiting for exactly this long. She stood in the museum in January and felt the things settle into her properly for the first time. Not the story of Thomas Hale. Not the significance of the designation or the engineering record, or the legal history of a land claim closed without notification in 1902. The thing underneath all of that, which was simply that careful work done with full attention, for the right reasons, did not disappear. It waited. Sometimes it waited longer than anyone intended. Sometimes it waited in the dark under a forest floor, in a tin canister sealed with soldered seams. Sometimes it waited in a shoebox. Sometimes it waited in the practiced recitation of a grandmother who had never seen the thing itself, but somehow understood its shape. But it waited, and eventually someone came. And the waiting turned out to have been worth it. Audrey was still standing beside her. She had finished her coffee and was holding the empty cup and looking at the wagon house with the expression she'd had since the beginning. The one that was still absorbing. The one that might go on absorbing for the rest of her life. A little more each time she came back, which Meg suspected she would. He would have liked this, Audrey said. Not the museum. Not the designation or the attention or the formal acknowledgement of what he had built. Meg understood that without having to ask. He would have liked knowing it was found, that someone had come who could read what he had written, that the instructions on the wall had worked exactly as intended, that the system had held. Yes, Meg said. I think he would have. Audrey looked at her one more time. Then she walked toward the wagon house slowly, the way you approached something you had been moving toward your whole life, without knowing it. She stopped in front of it, raised her hand, and placed it flat against the wood. The same dark wood that had spent 137 years in a forest in Olympic Peninsula, through storms and silences and seasons beyond counting, waiting for exactly this. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Meg watched from where she stood and understood that this was the end of the story Thomas Hale had started in October of 1887, when he looked at the terrain and the sky and his sick wife and made the decision to stop and build something that would last. Not the end of the wagon house. That would go on. The museum would hold it. People would come. Children would press their faces to the glass and ask why he built it and get answers that would stay with them. But the end of the waiting, the long, patient, deliberate waiting of a structure built by a man who understood that some things took longer than one lifetime to arrive at their destination, who had sealed the proof in tin, written the instructions on the wall, hidden the letter to his children in a separate place from the letter to the world because he understood the difference between what belonged to everyone and what belonged to them, who had trusted that the distance would be crossed eventually by someone paying attention. Meg turned and walked toward the door, passing the engineering drawings under glass, passing the open notebook, passing the photograph of the forest clearing. Taken the morning the wagon house was lifted from the earth, for the first time since Thomas had asked it to stop. She paused at the threshold, looked back once. Audrey's hand was still on the wood. The wagon house was still standing. It had always been going to.